The spring of 1887 brought more than wildflowers to Cedar Ridge. It brought Miss Eleanor Harper, with her pressed traveling dress and leather satchel full of official documents. Stepping down from the territorial stage like judgment itself had come calling. 8-year-old Mercy Caldwell watched from behind the mercantile's rain barrel as the woman smoothed her skirts and surveyed the settlement with the careful eye of someone measuring deficiencies. Mercy's bare feet made no sound on the wooden walkway as she crept closer, her small frame allowing her to slip between the posts where grown folks would get stuck. The morning air still held winter's bite, but the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to show the pale green of new leaves. Papa had always said spring was the season of possibilities, when the world shook off winter's sleep and remembered how to grow. But watching Miss Harper's sharp gaze catalog every weathered board and patched roof in sight, Mercy wondered if some possibilities were better left sleeping. "You must be the territorial agent," said Pastor Williams, hurrying over with his best welcoming smile. His black coat was carefully brushed, and he'd taken extra time with his appearance this morning, a sure sign he was nervous about something. "We received word you'd be coming to inspect our situation." Miss Harper's chin lifted just enough to show she'd already formed opinions. "I'm here about the Caldwell children. Reports suggest they're living in conditions unsuitable for proper development." The words hit Mercy like a fist to the chest. She pressed herself tighter against the post, her heart hammering loud enough to wake the dead. Papa had been gone 3 months now, lost in the mine collapse that took 6 good men with him. The earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving behind widows and orphans, and a hole in the community that still ached like a fresh wound. Mama did her best, but her best included taking in washing and mending from sunup to midnight. Her fingers worked raw, and her cough getting worse each week. The cough that she tried to hide, but that kept the children awake at night. A harsh sound that spoke of worry and exhaustion, and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from carrying too much weight on shoulders that weren't meant for such burdens. "Now, Miss Harper," Pastor Williams said in that careful voice grown-ups used when they thought children might be listening, "the Caldwell family has been managing quite well considering. The community has been very supportive." "I'm sure you mean well, Pastor, but good intentions don't substitute for proper oversight. I've been sent to evaluate whether these children would be better served by placement in more stable environments." Placement. Mercy knew that word. She'd heard it whispered after other tragedies, when families got split apart and children disappeared into wagon trains heading east, never to be seen again. The Hensley children, after the fever, took both their parents. The Murphy boy, after his father drank himself to death, and his mother ran off with a traveling salesman. The word carried the weight of endings, of families torn apart by circumstances and bureaucrats, and people who measured love by the size of bank accounts rather than the size of hearts. Her stomach turned to ice water, and she slipped away from her hiding spot, her bare feet finding every familiar path through the settlement without conscious thought. Past the blacksmith shop, where Mr. Kalowski was already working over his forge, sending sparks dancing in the morning air. Past the schoolhouse that stood empty more often than not since their last teacher had departed for greener pastures back east. Past the church where Papa's funeral had been held on a cold February day that felt like a lifetime ago. Home was a quarter-mile past the church, where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods Papa had refused to cut because they reminded Mama of the trees back in Ohio. The cabin sat in their shadow, small but solid, built by Papa's own hands, with help from neighbors who understood that a man's home was his castle, no matter how modest that castle might be. The cabin looked smaller than usual as Mercy approached, seeing it through strangers' eyes. The roof Papa had been meaning to patch before the accident, where a few shingles had come loose during the winter storms. The front step that sat crooked because the ground had shifted during the spring thaw, creating a gap that would need to be filled before someone turned an ankle. The vegetable garden where 6-year-old Daniel was carefully placing seeds in rows their father had taught him to measure with his small hands. Daniel worked with the serious concentration that had marked him since Papa's death, as if taking over the garden was a sacred trust that required his very best effort. His too big work shirt, one of Papa's old ones that Mama had cut down, hung off his thin shoulders, and his brown hair stuck up in cowlicks that no amount of water could tame. He looked so much like Papa in that moment that Mercy's chest tightened with grief and love and fierce protectiveness. "Danny," Mercy called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Come inside. Right now." Her brother looked up, dirt streaked across one cheek, his hands black with earth. "But I ain't finished with the beans yet. Mama said to get them planted before the next rain, and you can see them clouds building over the mountains. If I don't get them in today. Now, Danny." Mercy's tone brooked no argument, and Daniel scrambled to his feet, recognizing the voice she used when real trouble was coming. He'd learned to trust that voice over the past months, just as they'd all learned to look to Mercy for guidance when the adult world failed to make sense. Inside, 3-year-old Hope was helping 4-year-old Matthew sort buttons from Mama's mending basket, both of them sitting cross-legged on the cabin's only rug. It was a braided creation Mama had made from scraps of worn-out clothing, each strand holding memories of dresses and shirts and better times. Hope's tiny fingers worked carefully to separate the wooden buttons from the bone ones, her face scrunched in concentration, while Matthew organized them by size with the methodical patience that marked him as Papa's son. Mama worked at the table by the window, taking advantage of the good light for detailed embroidery on Mrs. Peterson's Sunday dress. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore her oldest work dress, saved for the messiest tasks. But even wore clothes, even with worry lines around her eyes and her face thinner than it should be, Sarah Caldwell remained beautiful in the way that mattered, the beauty that came from strength and love, and the kind of grace that bloomed in the face of hardship. "Mama," Mercy said quietly, not wanting to frighten the little ones. "That territorial lady's here. She's talking to Pastor Williams about placement." Sarah's needle stilled. Her face, already thin from too many missed meals given to her children instead, went pale as winter sky. At 32, she looked older, worn down by grief and responsibility and the endless worry that came with keeping 4 children fed and sheltered on her own. But her voice stayed steady, betraying none of the fear that Mercy could see flickering in her blue eyes. "Are you certain? I heard her plain. Said we ain't being raised proper. Said she's here to see if we'd be better off in stable environments." Mercy spat the last words like they tasted bitter. Sarah set down her work with hands that only trembled slightly. "Then we'll just have to show her otherwise, won't we?" Before Mercy could ask what that meant, footsteps sounded on the path outside. Through the window, they could see Miss Harper approaching with Pastor Williams and Mrs. Peterson, who ran the settlement's unofficial women's organization and served as midwife, teacher, and general source of practical wisdom for anyone who needed it. Mrs. Peterson's presence was encouraging. She'd always been fair-minded and had genuine affection for the Caldwell family. "Children," Sarah said softly, "remember your manners. Answer any questions truthfully, but don't volunteer information unless asked directly. And Mercy." She caught her eldest daughter's eye, and in that look passed a communication that went deeper than words. "Let me do the talking." The knock came firm and official, different from the casual rapping that neighbors used when they called. Sarah smoothed her apron, checked that her hair was properly pinned, and opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but conveyed welcome nonetheless. "Mrs. Caldwell," Pastor Williams said, "this is Miss Eleanor Harper from the territorial office. She'd like to speak with you about the children's welfare." "Of course. Please come in." Sarah stepped aside, and Mercy watched Miss Harper's sharp gaze catalog everything: the clean but patched clothing, the sparse furniture, the way little Hope instinctively moved closer to Matthew when strangers entered their space, the careful economy that marked a household where every penny was counted twice before being spent. The cabin felt smaller with 3 adults in it, though it had never seemed cramped when Papa was alive. His presence had filled the space differently, with warmth and laughter and the comfortable assurance that someone strong was keeping watch. Now the rooms felt exposed, vulnerable, as if Miss Harper's attention to detail could see through walls and uncover any flaws or cracks that may be used against them. "I appreciate your hospitality," Miss Harper said, accepting the chair Sarah offered, the only good chair they owned, one Papa had made from oak he'd carefully selected and seasoned. I'm here to assess the living conditions and care arrangements for your children. I understand you've been managing alone since your husband's death. Yes, ma'am. It's been a challenge, but we're managing well enough. Sarah's voice carried quiet dignity, the tone of someone who had learned to hold her head high regardless of circumstances. Miss Harper opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a sheet of papers covered in official seals and dense typing. According to my reports, you're supporting the family through washing and mending work. Is that sufficient income for proper nutrition and education? We eat regular meals, Sarah replied carefully. And the older children attend school when weather permits and when there's a teacher available. When weather permits. Miss Harper's eyebrows rose. Education should be consistent, Mrs. Caldwell. And I noticed the children appear somewhat thin. Mercy felt her face flush hot with indignation. They weren't thin because Mama didn't care for them. They were thin because Mama gave them her portions more often than not, because keeping 4 children fed on washing money meant someone had to do without, and Sarah Caldwell would starve herself before she let her babies go hungry. They were thin because grief had stolen appetites and worry had stolen sleep, because growing children needed more than a washing woman could earn, no matter how hard she worked or how many hours she labored. They're healthy children, Mrs. Peterson interjected firmly. Sarah's done remarkable work keeping this family together under difficult circumstances. The whole community admires what she's accomplished. Miss Harper's smile held no warmth. I'm sure she's done her best. But sometimes a mother's best isn't what's best for the children. I've seen promising placements for families willing to take in orphan children. Stable homes with resources for proper education and development. We ain't orphans, Daniel said suddenly, his small voice fierce with the kind of outrage that only children could muster. Our mama's right here. Daniel, Sarah warned gently, but Miss Harper was already making notes in her portfolio. The children seemed quite attached to their current situation, the agent observed. That's natural, of course, but children often resist changes that are ultimately beneficial. Emotional attachment doesn't always align with practical needs. She looked directly at Mercy, and her gaze felt like being examined under a magnifying glass. I'll need to conduct individual interviews to better assess their needs and capabilities. Perhaps we could start with the oldest. Miss Caldwell, would you walk with me? I'd like to see more of your community resources. Mercy glanced at her mother, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The gesture carried trust and warning in equal measure. Trust that Mercy would represent the family well. Warning that every word would matter. Yes, ma'am. Outside, Miss Harper walked slowly, studying the settlement with obvious disapproval. Cedar Ridge had been built by practical people with practical priorities, and it showed. The buildings were functional rather than pretty, constructed by folks more concerned with keeping out weather than impressing visitors. Unpainted lumber had weathered to silver gray, and most structures showed the repairs and modifications that came from making do with available materials and limited funds. Children played in the dust between houses, their laughter echoing off the surrounding hills where mining operations had scarred the landscape with a harsh geometry of human ambition. A group of boys had organized a game involving sticks and rocks and rules that seemed to change with each play. 2 little girls chased a chicken that had escaped from someone's coop, their delighted shrieks mixing with the birds' indignant squawks. Tell me about your daily routine, Mercy, Miss Harper said. What are your responsibilities? I help Mama with the little ones. Make sure they eat breakfast before school when there's school to attend. Help with lessons when they don't understand something. Mercy chose her words carefully, remembering Mama's warning about volunteering information. And what about your own education? Do you attend school regularly? Yes, ma'am, when there's school to attend. The teacher had left in February when the territorial funding ran out, and they were still waiting for a replacement. Most of the children were falling behind, but Mercy tried to keep up with the younger ones' learning by sharing what she remembered from her own lessons. I see. And, at home, do you feel you have adequate supervision? Time for play and childhood activities? The question felt like a trap, weighted with assumptions about what childhood should look like. I play with my brothers and sister plenty. We got the whole creek to explore and woods full of adventures. Best playground anybody could ask for. Miss Harper's expression suggested that unsupervised exploration wasn't what she had in mind. What about when your mother is working? Who watches the younger children? I do. But that isn't unusual here. Lots of families depend on older children to help with the younger ones. It's how communities work when everybody's got to pitch in. You're 8 years old, Mercy. That's a considerable responsibility for someone your age. They'd reached the creek where Daniel had built a small dam with rocks and sticks over the winter, creating a shallow pool where the little ones could play safely during the warmer months. The construction showed both engineering sense and artistic flair, with carefully balanced stones creating channels that directed water flow while maintaining a deep enough pool for small children to splash in safely. Miss Harper stared at the construction with obvious concern. The children play here unsupervised. It ain't deep enough to hurt nobody. Danny made sure of that when he built it. And I'm always watching when they're near the water. We all learned to swim before we could walk proper. Papa saw to that. You're always watching, Miss Harper repeated, making another note. That's exactly my concern. A child your age shouldn't carry such responsibility. Mercy felt frustration building in her chest like steam in a kettle. How could she explain that watching her siblings wasn't a burden but a privilege? That the way Hope's face lit up when Mercy read her stories, or how Matthew always came to her when nightmares woke him, or how Daniel trusted her to help him with the hard words in his reader. How could she explain that these things made her feel important and needed and loved in ways that went deeper than duty? They're my family, she said simply. I understand that. But families come in many forms, Mercy. Sometimes loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even if it's difficult to accept. They walked back toward the cabin in silence, Miss Harper occasionally stopping to examine details that seemed to confirm whatever conclusions she'd already reached. The roof's missing shingles. The laundry lines heavy with other people's clothes, evidence of the endless work that kept the family fed. The small garden that represented hope more than harvest, planted with the faith that spring would bring both food and better times. At the door, Miss Harper turned to Mercy with something that might have been kindness if it hadn't been wrapped in such certainty. I want you to know that any decisions made will be in your best interests. All of your best interests. Inside, Mercy found her family waiting exactly as she'd left them. But something had changed. Hope sat in Matthew's lap instead of playing with buttons. Daniel had moved closer to Mama's chair. Even 3-year-old Hope seemed to sense the threat hanging over them, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Mrs. Caldwell, Miss Harper said, settling back into the good chair. I'll be staying in town for several days to complete my assessment. I'll want to observe the children in various situations, speak with community members, and review the family's overall circumstances before making my recommendations. Of course, Sarah replied. We have nothing to hide. But Mercy heard the slight tremor in her mother's voice and knew that wasn't entirely true. They were hiding how often Mama cried after the children were asleep, standing at the window that looked toward the cemetery where Papa lay beneath a simple wooden cross. They were hiding how she sometimes stared at Papa's empty chair with such longing it hurt to watch. They were hiding how close they skated to real hunger some weeks, how many nights Mama stayed up mending by candlelight to earn a few extra coins, working until her fingers bled and her eyes burned. They were hiding how desperately they loved each other, and how losing that love would destroy them all in ways that no amount of proper food or education could ever repair. After Miss Harper left with promises to return the next day, the cabin felt smaller and quieter than usual. The children gathered around Sarah's chair like chicks seeking shelter under their mother's wing, and she wrapped her arms around as many of them as she could reach, her face buried in Hope's soft hair. Are they going to take us away, Mama? Matthew asked in a whisper that seemed too big for his small voice. I won't let that happen, Sarah said firmly. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. But Mercy caught the look of worry that flickered across her mother's face when she thought the children weren't watching, and she knew that love and determination might not be enough. Miss Harper had the law behind her and official papers, and the authority to make decisions that would tear their family apart based on standards that had nothing to do with happiness or belonging or the kind of love that made a house into a home. That night, after the younger children had been tucked into their shared bed with stories and songs and the kind of gentle attention that made even the darkest worries seem manageable, Mercy lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of home. Daniel's soft snoring, Hope mumbling in her sleep about horses and flowers, and whatever dreams visited 3-year-old minds. The creak of Mama's chair as she continued her mending by lamplight, working past exhaustion because the work never ended and the bills never stopped coming. Through the thin walls, she could hear the night sounds of the settlement. Dogs barking in the distance. The occasional voice from the saloon where the miners went to forget their troubles. The whistle of wind through the trees Papa had loved, carrying the scent of pine and possibility from the mountains beyond. Somewhere in all those familiar sounds was the answer to their problem. Mercy was sure of it. She just had to be smart enough and brave enough to find it before Miss Harper's assessment turned into separation orders that would scatter the Caldwell children like dandelion seeds on the wind. Because Miss Harper was wrong about one thing. Mercy wasn't too young to carry responsibility. She was exactly old enough to save her family, if she could figure out how. Papa had always said that the best solutions came from understanding the problem completely, and Mercy intended to understand Miss Harper better than the territorial agent understood herself. The woman might have papers and authority and the sincere belief that she was helping, but Mercy had something more powerful. The wisdom that came from knowing exactly what mattered most and the fierce determination to protect it at any cost. Spring had brought trouble to Cedar Ridge in the form of a well-meaning stranger with dangerous ideas about what families should look like. But Mercy Caldwell intended to make sure that by the time the seasons turned again, Miss Harper would understand that love came in many forms, and that sometimes the strongest families were the ones that grew from necessity, nurtured by sacrifice, and held together by bonds that no amount of official paperwork could ever break. Summer brought longer days and harder work to Cedar Ridge, but for the Caldwell family, it also brought hope disguised as opportunity. Miss Harper had extended her stay indefinitely, taking rooms at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house and conducting what she called comprehensive observations of the children's welfare. 3 weeks had passed since that first terrifying encounter, and Mercy had spent every waking moment watching and learning, the way Papa had taught her to study the forest before hunting. Miss Harper believed in schedules and structure, in children who sat quietly with folded hands and spoke only when spoken to. She measured worth in clean fingernails and recited lessons rather than the kind of practical wisdom that kept families fed and safe. More importantly, Mercy had discovered that Miss Harper genuinely believed she was helping. The woman's eyes held no cruelty when she spoke of placing the children in more suitable environments. She truly thought splitting them apart would give them better lives, which made her more dangerous than any intentional villain. You could fight someone who meant harm, but how did you fight someone who meant well? The answer had come to Mercy gradually, built from dozens of small observations and one crucial conversation with old Henrik Johansson, the Swedish carpenter who'd helped Papa build their cabin. Henrik had fought in the war back east before coming west to forget what he'd seen, and he understood both conflict and survival in ways that most folks didn't. You can't reason with someone who's already convinced they're right, Henrik had told Mercy when she'd stopped by his workshop that morning. He was crafting a cradle for the new baby the Petersons expected in the fall, his weathered hands moving with the sureness that came from decades of careful work. But you can show them a different kind of right. What do you mean? Mercy had asked, accepting the cup of milk Henrik's wife Anna always pressed into her hands. The Swedish woman understood hunger in ways that went beyond words, and she'd taken to feeding any child who crossed her threshold. Sometimes people need to see what they're trying to fix ain't broken, just different from what they know. That conversation had planted the seed of an idea that grew throughout the morning as Mercy watched Miss Harper make more notes during her visit to the schoolhouse. The territorial agent had been appalled to discover that their temporary teacher, young Tom Bradley from the next settlement over, sometimes let the children learn through games and practical application rather than rote memorization. Tom was barely 20 himself, Hired when the territorial funding ran out and they couldn't afford a proper teacher. He'd come cheap because he was young and inexperienced, but he'd proven to have a natural gift for reaching children who'd been written off as slow or difficult. His methods were unconventional, letting children work with their hands while they learned their numbers, encouraging them to tell stories that incorporated their lessons, using the natural world around them as a classroom. Educational standards must be maintained, Miss Harper had informed him in that crisp voice that brooked no argument. Children require structure and discipline to develop properly. This creative approach may seem engaging, but it doesn't prepare them for the realities of formal education. Tom had nodded politely while Mercy saw the frustration in his eyes. He'd been making real progress with some of the slower students, including Daniel, who'd finally begun to read with confidence after Tom started letting him trace letters in sand before writing them on slate. But Miss Harper saw only chaos where Tom saw learning, disorder where he saw engagement. The territorial agent had spent considerable time questioning the children about their lessons, their daily routines, their understanding of proper behavior. She'd been particularly concerned about the freedom they enjoyed during their non-school hours, the way they roamed the settlement and surrounding wilderness with minimal supervision, learning from whoever was willing to teach them. Children need consistent guidance, she told Pastor Williams during one of their frequent conversations on Mrs. Fletcher's front porch. This haphazard approach to child rearing may produce hardy individuals, but it doesn't create civilized citizens. That word, civilized, stuck in Mercy's mind like a thorn. Miss Harper used it often, always with the implication that what they had in Cedar Ridge fell short of some Eastern standard of proper living, as if the skills that kept families alive in the mountains were somehow less valuable than the accomplishments that impress people in cities. But Mercy had begun to understand something important about Miss Harper. The woman wasn't just judging their circumstances, she was comparing them to her own ideals of what childhood should look like. Those ideals had been shaped by a world very different from the frontier, a world where children could afford to be helpless because adults had the resources to help them. The realization had sparked a plan that was both simple and audacious. If Miss Harper needed to see different kinds of competence, different measures of success, then Mercy would provide them. But she'd need help, and she'd need to be careful. One wrong move could make things worse for her family, could provide the evidence Miss Harper needed to justify her worst fears. Now, as afternoon heat shimmered off the settlement's dusty main street, Mercy put the first phase of her plan into action. She found Miss Harper at the boarding house, reviewing her notes in the shade of Mrs. Fletcher's front porch, where a slight breeze provided relief from the summer sun. "Excuse me, ma'am," Mercy said politely, approaching with the careful deference that adults expected from children. "I was wondering if you'd like to see something." Miss Harper looked up from her papers, her expression guarded. Over the past weeks, she'd grown accustomed to Mercy's quiet presence during her observations, but this was the first time the child had initiated contact. "What kind of something, Mercy?" "Well, you've been asking about our education and such, about how we learn things here. I thought maybe you'd want to see how we really solve problems. Practical problems that matter to folks' daily lives." Interest flickered in the agent's eyes. Part of her assessment involved understanding how frontier children develop skills and knowledge, though she'd shown little appreciation for the unconventional methods they employed. "I suppose that would be informative. What did you have in mind?" "There's a situation down at the creek that needs addressing. The spring runoff damaged the water system the men built for the settlement. Mr. Bradley mentioned it as a problem that would require significant engineering to fix, but I've been studying it, and I think there might be a simpler solution." This wasn't entirely true. The settlement's water system did need repair, but the men planned to fix it themselves come Sunday, when they could spare a full day for the work. However, Mercy had spent considerable time studying the problem and believed she understood both the issue and a potential solution. Miss Harper closed her portfolio with a careful precision that marked all her movements. "Very well. Show me this problem." They walked toward the creek, passing other children engaged in the kind of activities that seemed to puzzle Miss Harper. A group of boys was constructing an elaborate fort from fallen branches and imagination, Their engineering both sophisticated and completely unsupervised. Daniel and Matthew were among them, working with the serious concentration that had marked Daniel since Papa's death, as if taking his place among the older boys was a sacred trust. Near the church, Hope helped Mrs. Peterson's daughter, Mary, pick wildflowers for pressing, both little girls chattering in the mixture of languages that marked frontier communities. English peppered with Swedish phrases from the Johanssons, German words from the Mueller family, and Spanish from the vaqueros, who sometimes passed through with cattle herds. The children seemed to roam quite freely, Miss Harper observed, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, ma'am, but they're not really unsupervised. See Mrs. Peterson there, hanging wash? She can see the girls. And Mr. Kalowski at the forge, he's keeping an eye on the boys' fort building. Everybody watches out for everybody else's children here. I see. And you consider this adequate supervision? Mercy chose her words carefully. I consider it community. When trouble comes, every adult in sight becomes responsible for every child in sight. It's different from having one person watching all the time, but it's not less safe. At the creek, Mercy pointed to where the main water channel had been blocked by debris from the spring floods. The settlement's ingenious system of wooden channels and catch basins, designed to provide fresh water to each family's property, had been partially destroyed when a fallen tree had altered the creek's flow during the violent storms that marked Mountain Springs. The men figured they'd need to clear all that debris and rebuild the whole channel system, Mercy explained, gesturing to the tangle of logs and rocks that had diverted the creek from its intended path. They've been planning to tackle it this Sunday, when they can spare the time from other work. But I think there might be a way to work with what's already here instead of fighting against it. Miss Harper frowned, studying the problem with new attention. This seems quite complex for a child to analyze. Are you certain you understand the engineering involved? The question stung, but Mercy kept her voice level. Papa taught me to watch how water moves before he died. Said it was one of the most important things to understand if you wanted to survive out here. Water always finds the easiest path, and fighting that just makes problems. I see. And how would you address this situation? Mercy had hoped she'd ask. She led Miss Harper upstream to where the creek made a sharp bend around a large boulder, pointing out the natural features that most people overlooked in their hurry to impose human solutions on natural problems. See, the water wants to go this way natural-like, she said, indicating a narrow gap between rocks that the creek was already trying to exploit. But the old system fought against that, trying to force the water to follow the path that was convenient for people instead of the path that made sense for the creek. She waded into the stream, her bare feet finding secure footing on the familiar bottom. The water was cool and clear, running fast enough to stay clean, but not so fast as to be dangerous. If we redirect just this section and let the water follow its own inclinations, it'll do most of the work for us. Miss Harper watched from the bank, her expression shifting from skepticism to genuine curiosity as Mercy began positioning stones to create a gentle redirect in the current. It was work she'd done dozens of times in miniature, playing with stream flow during long afternoons when her siblings napped and the world grew quiet around the creek. Small changes first, Mercy explained as she worked. Move these rocks to guide the water gradual-like, instead of trying to force it all at once. The creek knows where it wants to go, we just have to help it get there. Each stone was chosen for size and shape, positioned with the kind of precision that came from understanding both the physics of flowing water and the patience required to work with natural forces instead of against them. Mercy had been gathering suitable rocks for weeks, testing different configurations in her mind before attempting the actual work. Miss Harper observed in silence, as what had started as a trickle became a steady flow, directing clean creek water toward the settlement's distribution system with increasing efficiency. The work required knowledge of hydrostatics and engineering principles, but it also demanded something else, the kind of intuitive understanding that came from spending years watching water move through the landscape. That's actually quite sophisticated, Miss Harper admitted reluctantly, though I remain concerned about a child your age working alone near water. I ain't alone, Mercy replied, nodding toward the settlement. True enough, several people had noticed their activity and wandered over to observe. Henrik Johansson stood with his arms crossed, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. Mrs. Peterson had arrived with Hope and Mary, both little girls excited to see Mercy fixing the water, as Hope put it. Tom Bradley appeared as Mercy was placing the final stones, his young face showing surprise and genuine admiration. "Well, I'll be. Mercy, this is exactly what the engineers in Denver would have recommended. How did you know to approach it this way?" "Papa taught me to watch the water," she repeated, climbing out of the creek and wiping her hands on her skirt. "And I've been thinking about this problem for weeks, studying how the flow patterns changed after the spring floods." Weeks. Miss Harper's voice held a new note, something between surprise and concern. "You've been working on this solution for weeks?" "Yes, ma'am. Ever since the spring floods messed up the original system." Mercy met her gaze directly. "See, grown folks sometimes make things harder than they need to be. They want to build big and strong and permanent. But sometimes the best answer is working with what's already there instead of fighting against it." A small crowd had gathered now, including several of the men who'd been planning the Sunday repair work. They examined Mercy's solution with the careful attention of people who understood the value of both effort and efficiency. Men who'd learned through hard experience that the best engineering often looked simple from the outside. "This'll work fine," declared Jim Morrison, whose mining experience made him the settlement's unofficial expert on water management and hydraulics. "Better than what we had planned, truth be told. Girls got a real head for this kind of problem solving. Sees things the rest of us missed." "Saved us a full day's work," added Carl Mueller, the German farmer whose property lay furthest from a creek, "and probably did a better job than we would have managed with our approach." Miss Harper observed the easy acceptance with which the adults treated Mercy's contribution. No one seemed surprised that an 8-year-old had developed a working solution to their engineering problem. If anything, they appeared proud, the way communities feel when one of their own demonstrates unexpected competence. "This is all very impressive," Miss Harper said carefully, "but it raises questions about appropriate activities for children. Shouldn't Mercy be in school or engaged in supervised play rather than attempting to solve adult problems?" Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. Hope balanced on her hip while Mary clung to her skirt. "Miss Harper, with respect, this is how children learn here. Not just from books, but from doing. From being part of the community's work and taking responsibility for its welfare." "Mercy's been helping her family and neighbors since she could walk," Henrik added in his careful English, still accented after 20 years in America. "It's made her wise beyond her years, Ja. Practical wisdom that serves everyone. But surely formal education is important too," Tom Bradley interrupted gently. "But Mercy's reading level is advanced for her age. Her arithmetic is excellent, and her problem-solving skills are remarkable. She's not falling behind academically by having practical responsibilities. If anything, the real-world applications help her understand the theoretical material better." Miss Harper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Academic achievement is only one measure of proper development. Children need time for childhood, for play, for freedom from adult responsibilities that shape their character. "We play plenty," Daniel said, appearing at Mercy's elbow with Matthew close behind, both boys muddy from their fort-building activities. "Mercy taught us how to track animals and read weather signs and make whistles from willow bark. She knows more games than anybody. And she tells the best stories," Matthew added eagerly. "Especially the ones about brave kids who save their families from dragons and such. Stories where children are heroes, not just people who need rescuing." Miss Harper's expression grew thoughtful. "Stories, you say? What kind of stories does Mercy tell?" Hope wriggled down from Mrs. Peterson's arms and ran to Mercy, wrapping small arms around her sister's waist with the unconscious affection that marked their relationship. Mercy tells about the brave girl who could talk to horses, and the boy who saved his whole town from the bad men, and the magic children who could make plants grow just by singing to them. "And they're always about kids being heroes," Daniel added proudly. "Not grown-ups coming to save the day, but children figuring things out for themselves." Miss Harper knelt to Hope's level, her voice taking on the careful tone adults used when questioning small children. Do you like Mercy's stories better than other stories you've heard? Oh yes. Hope's face lit up with enthusiasm. Because in Mercy's stories, the kids are smart and brave, and they don't need grown-ups to rescue them. They rescue themselves and save everybody else too. A flicker of something, understanding, perhaps, or concern, crossed Miss Harper's face. She straightened slowly, studying Mercy with new attention, as if seeing her for the first time rather than through the lens of preconceived notions about what children should be. I think I'm beginning to understand something, she said quietly. Mercy, would you walk with me again? I have more questions, but I'd prefer to discuss them privately. They left the crowd admiring the restored water flow and walked toward the edge of the settlement, where the forest began and the mountains rose like sentinels against the sky. Miss Harper seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at Mercy as if trying to reconcile the child she'd observed with a competent problem solver she'd just witnessed. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the breeze. Birds called from the depths of the forest, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a dead tree with mechanical persistence. It was the kind of peaceful moment that made the world seem larger and more forgiving than human problems suggested. Tell me about your stories, Miss Harper said finally. The ones your siblings mentioned. Why are the heroes always children? Mercy felt cautious, sensing that this question carried more weight than casual curiosity. I guess because kids see things different sometimes. Adults get set in their ways, thinking they know how things have to be done. But children, we ain't learned yet that some things are supposed to be impossible. I see. And in your stories, do these child heroes ever receive help from adults? Sometimes, when the adults are smart enough to listen instead of just talking. Mercy glanced sideways at Miss Harper, testing the waters. Most grown-ups think they know what's best for kids without asking what the kids think might work better. Miss Harper stopped walking. They'd reached a small meadow where wildflowers grew in casual abundance, their colors bright against the green grass. In the distance, the settlement looked peaceful and purposeful, smoke rising from chimneys where families prepared evening meals, children's voices carrying on the warm air. Mercy, Miss Harper said slowly, do you believe your current living situation is what's best for you and your siblings? Yes, ma'am. I surely do. Even though it's difficult? Even though you carry responsibilities that many would consider inappropriate for a child your age. Mercy sat down on a fallen log, gesturing for Miss Harper to join her. When the adult hesitated, Mercy smiled with a kind of patience that seemed older than her years. You asked me to tell you what I think, but you got to sit down to hear it proper. That's the rule for important conversations. Despite herself, Miss Harper sat, arranging her skirts with the automatic precision that marked her every movement. You think what we got is hard, Mercy began, and maybe it is compared to some places. But hard ain't the same as wrong. Papa used to say that the strongest trees are the ones that grow in rocky soil, because they learn to send their roots deep and hold on tight when the storms come. She picked up a small stone and turned it over in her hands, studying its surface while she chose her words. Our family's like that tree. We got strong roots because we had to grow them, and we know how to hold on to each other when things get difficult. But children shouldn't have to be strong in that way, Mercy. They should be protected, allowed to be innocent and carefree. Says who? The question came out sharper than Mercy intended, and she softened her tone. I mean, who decided that children can't be strong and innocent at the same time? That caring for people you love makes you less of a child. Miss Harper opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently reconsidering her answer. I love my family, Mercy continued. Taking care of them don't feel like work to me. It feels like love. When Hope has nightmares, and I sing her back to sleep, when Daniel needs help with his reading, when Matthew wants someone to listen to his big ideas about how the world works, those ain't burdens. They're gifts. But what about your own needs? Your own childhood? Mercy gestured toward the meadow, the mountains, the vast sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. This is my childhood. Running free in country most folks only dream about, learning from people who know how to survive and thrive in places that would break city folks. Having brothers and sister who trust me and depend on me and love me enough to let me help them grow up strong. She met Miss Harper's eyes directly. You want to give us better lives, and I understand that. But you're measuring better by standards that don't fit what we got here. You see me taking care of my siblings and think it's too much responsibility. I see it as the best job in the world. Miss Harper was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice held a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. In my experience, children who carry adult responsibilities too early often struggle to form healthy relationships later in life. They miss crucial developmental stages. And in my experience, Mercy replied gently, children who learn to love and be loved, who understand that families take care of each other, who know they're needed and valued. Those children grow up knowing how to build the kind of relationships that last. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. From the settlement came the sounds of evening routines, mothers calling children home for supper, dogs barking, the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle. I should get back, Mercy said, standing and brushing off her skirt. Mama will be starting supper soon, and the little ones get fussy when they're hungry. Miss Harper rose as well, but she didn't immediately turn toward the settlement. Instead, she stood in the meadow, looking toward the mountains, as if searching for answers in their ancient slopes. Mercy, she said finally, if I were to recommend that your family remain together, what assurances could you give me that the children's welfare would be properly maintained? Hope bloomed in Mercy's chest, but she kept her voice steady. The same assurance I can give you right now, ma'am. That we love each other enough to do whatever it takes to keep our family strong and healthy and together. And if circumstances become more difficult, if your mother's health fails, or if economic pressures increase, then we'll face those problems the way families do, together, with help from our community when we need it, and by helping our community when they need us. Miss Harper nodded slowly, though her expression remained thoughtful. I'll need to complete my assessment before making any formal recommendations. But I admit you've given me much to consider. As they walked back toward the settlement, Mercy allowed herself to feel cautious optimism. She'd planted seeds of doubt in Miss Harper's certainty, had shown her a different way of measuring success and strength. But the territorial agent was still a woman with official authority and firmly held beliefs about proper child rearing. The real test would come in the days ahead, as Miss Harper observed how the Caldwell family functioned not just in moments of crisis, but in the daily rhythms of love and work and mutual support that made them more than the sum of their individual parts. Summer was deepening around Cedar Ridge, bringing with it the kind of long, golden days that made even the hardest work seem manageable. But Mercy knew that autumn would come eventually, and with it, Miss Harper's final decision about their family's future. She could only hope that by then, the territorial agent would have learned to see strength where she once saw hardship, and love where she once saw inadequate supervision. Because the Caldwell children weren't broken and didn't need fixing. They just needed the chance to prove that families could be strong in ways that couldn't be measured by official standards or bureaucratic requirements. They needed the chance to show that wisdom came in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest hands could carry the biggest responsibilities with grace, love, and the kind of courage that only grew from knowing exactly what mattered most. The first frost came early that year, painting the cottonwoods gold and crimson, while September still held summer's warmth in its depths. But for the Caldwell family, the changing season brought more than colored leaves. It brought the knowledge that Miss Harper's assessment period was drawing to a close, and with it, the decision that would determine their future. Mercy woke before dawn on the morning that would prove to be the most important of her young life, though she had no way of knowing it then. The cabin was quiet except for the familiar sounds of her family sleeping. Daniel's soft snoring, Hope's occasional murmur, Matthew's restless shifting as he fought whatever battles visited his dreams. From her parents' bed came the sound she'd learned to dread, Mama's cough, worse now as the nights grew cold and her body struggled with exhaustion that seemed to deepen with each passing week. Through the small window beside her bed, Mercy could see the settlement beginning to stir. Lamplight flickered in kitchen windows as women started breakfast fires. The first miners emerged from their cabins, lunch pails in hand, heading for the early shift that would take them deep into the mountain's belly. It was a kind of peaceful morning that made the world seem orderly and manageable, but Mercy felt tension coiled in her stomach like a snake preparing to strike. Miss Harper had requested a final meeting with the family this afternoon, after completing what she called supplementary observations with various community members. The territorial agent had spent the past week conducting interviews with everyone from Pastor Williams to old Henrik Johansson, gathering opinions about the Caldwell children's welfare and the community's ability to provide adequate support. Mercy had tried to gauge the woman's thinking from her behavior, but Miss Harper had grown increasingly difficult to read as her assessment progressed. Sometimes she seemed genuinely impressed by what she observed, the way the children helped each other with lessons, their easy relationships with various adults in the settlement, their practical competence in handling daily responsibilities. But other times, Mercy caught her making notes with the kind of tight-lipped concentration that suggested disapproval. The uncertainty was wearing on the whole family. Mama had grown thinner and more fragile-looking, her cough keeping them all awake at night. Daniel had taken to following Mercy around like a lost puppy, seeking reassurance she couldn't give. Matthew had become unusually quiet, and Hope clung to whoever was nearest with the desperate intensity of a child who sensed trouble she couldn't understand. This morning, however, would test everything Mercy had learned about Miss Harper's character and challenge the territorial agent's assumptions in ways that no amount of careful planning could have anticipated. The crisis began, as crises often do, with something small and seemingly unrelated. Mrs. Peterson's youngest daughter, 4-year-old Emma, had been fighting a fever for 3 days. What had started as sniffles and general fussiness had progressed to something more serious overnight, and by dawn, the little girl was burning with fever and struggling to breathe. Mercy learned about the emergency when Hope burst into the cabin just after sunrise, her face flushed with the importance of bearing news. "Emma's real sick," she announced to the family gathered around the breakfast table. Mrs. Peterson sent Mary to ask if Mama knows what to do, 'cause the fever won't break and she's making scary sounds when she breathes. Sarah was on her feet before Hope finished speaking, her practical instincts overriding the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Mercy watched the children. "I'll go see what I can do." But as Sarah reached for her shawl, a violent coughing fit seized her, doubling her over and leaving her gasping for breath. When she straightened, there was blood on her lips, just a few drops, but enough to make Mercy's heart skip with fear. "Mama, you ain't well enough," Mercy said firmly. "You'll just make yourself sicker, and Emma too, if you're carrying something." "Child's right," came a voice from the doorway. Henrik Johansson stood there, his weathered face grave with concern. "Anna's with Mrs. Peterson now, but she says the little one needs more help than we can give. Fever's too high, breathing's too labored. Someone needs to ride to Millerville for the doctor." Millerville was 20 miles away through mountain passes that were treacherous even in good weather. The round trip would take the better part of a day, assuming the doctor was available and willing to make the journey. Emma might not have that much time. "What about Mrs. Mueller?" Sarah asked, referring to the German woman who served as the settlement's unofficial midwife and healer. "She knows more about fevers than anyone." Henrik shook his head. "Gone to help with a difficult birth 2 settlements over. Won't be back for days." The situation was desperate, and Mercy could see the terrible calculation playing out in the adults' minds. Someone had to do something, but their options were limited and time was running short. In the silence that followed Henrik's pronouncement, they could hear commotion from the Peterson house, urgent voices, and the sound of someone crying. That was when Miss Harper appeared. The territorial agent had been staying at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, which shared a fence line with the Petersons' property. She'd obviously been awakened by the disturbance and had come to investigate, her dark hair hastily pinned and her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "What's happening?" she asked, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. Henrik explained the situation quickly, his accent thickening with worry. "Little Emma Peterson. She's burning with fever and can't breathe proper." We need medical help, but the doctor's a days right away. Miss Harper's expression shifted to professional concern. I have some medical training, she said. Basic nursing, but perhaps enough to help stabilize the child until proper medical care can be obtained. Relief flickered across Henrik's face. That would be a blessing, miss. Mrs. Peterson's beside herself. But as they started toward the Peterson house, Mercy felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. She'd watched Miss Harper long enough to understand how the woman's mind worked. The territorial agent would see this crisis as validation of her concerns about frontier life, proof that the settlement lacked adequate resources to care for children properly. More importantly, Miss Harper would undoubtedly notice that in this moment of genuine emergency, the community was turning to her, an outsider with official training, rather than relying on their own resources. It would reinforce every argument she'd made about the need for proper institutions and professional oversight. At the Peterson house, they found chaos barely contained by desperation. Emma lay in her small bed, her face flushed with fever and her breathing rapid and shallow. Mrs. Peterson sat beside her, alternately bathing the child's forehead with cool water and trying to coax her to drink small sips of water. Mary huddled in the corner, her young face streaked with tears as she watched her sister struggle. Miss Harper took charge immediately, her demeanor shifting to professional competence as she examined the sick child. She checked Emma's pulse, listened to her breathing, and felt her forehead with a kind of systematic thoroughness that spoke of real training. The fever is dangerously high, she announced. We need to bring it down quickly or there could be permanent damage. Do you have ice? Alcohol for bathing? Willow bark tea. Mrs. Peterson shook her head helplessly. We used the last of our ice yesterday, and I don't know how to make willow bark tea. I've just been doing what my mother taught me, cool water and prayers. Miss Harper's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll have to work with what we have. Can someone fetch more cool water? And clean cloths? As the adults bustled around following Miss Harper's instructions, Mercy found herself studying Emma with the kind of focused attention Papa had taught her to bring to any serious problem. The little girl's symptoms were familiar. She'd seen this kind of fever before, when Matthew had fallen ill 2 winters ago. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edge of her memory. The way Emma's breathing sounded, the particular flush of her cheeks, the way she moved restlessly even in her fevered state. It reminded her of something Mrs. Mueller had told her during Matthew's illness, something about reading the signs that doctors sometimes missed. Miss Harper, Mercy said quietly, can I ask you something? The territorial agent looked up from her examination, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Not now, Mercy. This is a medical emergency. Yes, ma'am, but that's why I need to ask. Did you check her ears? Her ears. Miss Harper's tone suggested the question was irrelevant. The child has a respiratory fever. Her ears are not the concern. But Mrs. Peterson was already moving toward the bed, understanding flickering in her eyes. Mercy might be onto something. Emma's been tugging at her right ear since yesterday, but I thought it was just part of the fussiness. Miss Harper hesitated, clearly reluctant to take medical advice from an 8-year-old. But professional curiosity won out, and she gently examined Emma's ears. Her expression changed immediately. There's significant inflammation, she admitted. But how did you know to suggest that? Mrs. Mueller taught me to watch for it when Matthew was sick, Mercy explained. She said ear infections in little ones can cause high fevers and breathing trouble, but they're easy to miss if you don't know to look. And Emma's been tilting her head to one side. That's usually a sign. Miss Harper stared at Mercy for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. What else did Mrs. Mueller teach you about treating ear infections in children? Mercy felt the weight of everyone's attention, but also the familiar confidence that came from knowledge earned through experience. Warm oil drops can help with the pain if you got oil that's clean. And sometimes a warm compress on the outside helps too. But the main thing is getting the fever down so it don't spread to other parts. Warm oil. Miss Harper's medical training was clearly wrestling with frontier remedies. That seems unconventional. Works though, Henrik said from the doorway, where he'd been listening. My Anna used the same treatment on our grandchildren when they visited last summer. Cleared up ear troubles that had been plaguing them for weeks. Miss Harper found herself in the uncomfortable position of having her authority challenged by folk wisdom that might actually be more applicable than her formal training. But Emma's worsening condition didn't allow for professional pride. "Very well," she said finally. "Mrs. Peterson, do you have clean cooking oil we could warm?" As the adults prepared the treatment Mercy had suggested, the young girl found herself thinking about the larger implications of what was happening. This crisis would certainly influence Miss Harper's final assessment, but maybe not in the way the territorial agent expected. Because what was becoming clear as the morning progressed was that frontier life didn't lack for knowledge or care. It simply distributed those resources differently than Miss Harper's urban experience suggested they should be. The settlement didn't have a doctor, but it had Mrs. Mueller's expertise passed down through generations of practical experience. It didn't have a hospital, but it had a community where everyone's knowledge contributed to everyone's welfare. And right now, the most immediately useful medical knowledge belonged to an 8-year-old girl who'd paid attention when the adults thought she was just playing. The warm oil treatment worked exactly as Mercy had predicted. Within an hour, Emma's breathing had eased and her fever had begun to break. The little girl was still sick, but she was no longer in immediate danger. Mrs. Peterson wept with relief, and even Mary stopped crying long enough to help her mother tend to her sister. Miss Harper supervised the continued care with professional attention, but Mercy could see her making mental notes about what had just occurred. The territorial agent had arrived prepared to handle a medical emergency with her formal training, only to discover that the real solution came from an 8-year-old who'd learned folk medicine from a German midwife. "Mercy," Miss Harper said as they prepared to leave the Peterson house, "what did you learn to observe symptoms so carefully?" "Mrs. Mueller taught me some, but mostly I learned from watching Papa with hurt miners and Mama with sick babies. You got to pay attention to what the body's telling you, not just what you think should be wrong. And this knowledge, it's common among the children here." Mercy shrugged. "We all learn what we need to know. Daniel's better with animal doctoring than me. Matthew can spot weather changes 2 days out. Hope knows which plants are safe to eat and which ones will make you sick." Miss Harper was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this information. "I see. And the adults encourage this kind of practical education." "They teach us what keeps people safe and healthy," Mercy replied. "Seems like that should be important no matter where you live." As they walked back toward the Caldwell cabin, Miss Harper seemed lost in thought. The morning's events had clearly shaken some of her assumptions about frontier child-rearing, but Mercy couldn't tell whether the change was working in their favor or against it. The answer came that afternoon, when Miss Harper arrived for her final meeting with the family. She carried her leather portfolio and the same official demeanor she'd maintained throughout her assessment, but something in her bearing had shifted. She seemed less certain, more thoughtful. "Mrs. Caldwell," she began formally, settling into the chair that had become hers over the past weeks. "I've completed my evaluation of your family's circumstances and the community's ability to provide adequate support for the children's welfare." Sarah sat straighter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The children arranged themselves around her chair as they had that first day, but now there was less fear in their positioning and more determination. They'd all grown during Miss Harper's stay, had learned to trust in their own strength and the bonds that held them together. "I must admit," Miss Harper continued, "that my assessment has been complicated by observations that don't align with my initial expectations." She opened her portfolio and withdrew several sheets of notes, but instead of consulting them immediately, she looked directly at each family member in turn. "When I arrived in Cedar Ridge, I was prepared to find children living in circumstances that required intervention. What I found instead was a family and community that challenges many of my assumptions about proper child development." Mercy felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "This morning's events were particularly illuminating," Miss Harper said. "I came to this community believing that children needed protection from adult responsibilities, that their welfare required professional oversight and institutional support. What I witnessed instead was a child whose education, albeit unconventional, enabled her to provide crucial assistance in a medical emergency. She paused, her gaze settling on Mercy. Your daughter demonstrated knowledge, judgment, and practical competence that many adults lack. More importantly, she demonstrated the kind of caring responsibility that suggests strong moral development. Sarah's hand found Mercy's, squeezing gently. I've also observed, Miss Harper continued, that this competence is not unique to Mercy, but extends throughout your family and the community. These children are not burdened by responsibility. They're empowered by it. They're not lacking in childhood experiences. They're having childhood experiences that many of their urban counterparts will never enjoy. She straightened her papers, but Mercy noticed that her hands weren't quite steady. Mrs. Caldwell, I cannot in good conscience recommend that this family be separated. While your circumstances are challenging, and while your methods are unconventional, it's clear that your children are thriving under your care and within this community. The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Hope squealed with delight, and Daniel hooped before catching himself and trying to look properly serious. Matthew grinned so widely it looked like his face might split, and Sarah began to cry, quiet tears of relief that she'd been holding back for weeks. But Miss Harper wasn't finished. However, she said, raising a hand for silence, I do have recommendations that I hope you'll consider. The community would benefit from more consistent educational resources, and I intend to recommend territorial funding for a permanent teacher. I'd also like to arrange for periodic visits from a traveling doctor to supplement the excellent folk medical knowledge that already exists here. She looked directly at Mercy. And I'd like to recommend that interested children be given opportunities for advanced education, should they choose to pursue it. Mercy's analytical abilities and problem-solving skills suggest she might benefit from exposure to more formal scientific training. Mercy felt excitement bubble up in her chest. Not because she wanted to leave her family, that would never be acceptable, but because the prospect of learning more, of understanding the principles behind the practical knowledge she'd already acquired, seemed like the greatest gift imaginable. These recommendations, Miss Harper continued, are intended to supplement what already exists here, not replace it. This community has taught me that there are many ways to raise healthy, capable children, and that love and practical wisdom often matter more than institutional resources. She closed her portfolio with the finality of someone concluding important business. My formal report will recommend that the Caldwell family remain intact, and that the community continue to provide the support structure that has proven so effective. As Miss Harper prepared to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at the family clustered together in their small cabin. Mrs. Caldwell, you've raised remarkable children. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. After the territorial agent left, the cabin erupted in celebration. Daniel danced around the room. Hope clapped her hands and sang a nonsense song about family staying together, and Matthew peppered everyone with questions about what would happen next. But Mercy found herself thinking about the deeper implications of what had just occurred. Miss Harper had arrived in Cedar Ridge with firm ideas about what children needed and how families should function. But instead of imposing those ideas, she'd allowed herself to be educated by what she observed. It was, Mercy realized, exactly what she'd been trying to achieve through all her careful demonstrations and conversations. She'd shown Miss Harper that competence came in many forms, that love could be expressed through responsibility as well as protection, and that strength could grow from hardship as easily as from comfort. As autumn deepened around Cedar Ridge and Miss Harper prepared to return east with her report, the settlement began to implement some of her recommendations. Funding arrived for a permanent teacher, young Tom Bradley, whose unconventional methods had proven so effective. A traveling doctor agreed to visit quarterly, bringing medical supplies and working with local healers like Mrs. Mueller to improve healthcare for the entire community. And for Mercy, there were new opportunities to learn and grow while remaining firmly rooted in the family and community that had shaped her. Books arrived from Denver, along with correspondence courses that would allow her to pursue advanced studies without leaving home. But perhaps the most important change was in how the community saw itself. Miss Harper's assessment had forced them to articulate what they'd always known, that their way of life produced strong, capable, caring children, and that love took many forms. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow and wrapping the settlement in the kind of quiet that made every sound seem significant. But inside the Caldwell cabin, warmth radiated from more than just the wood stove. It came from a knowledge that they'd faced their greatest test and emerged stronger than before. Mercy often thought about Miss Harper during those long winter evenings, wondering if the territorial agent had learned as much from Cedar Ridge as the settlement had learned from her. The woman had arrived believing she knew what was best for the Caldwell children, but she'd left understanding that sometimes the people who need help are the best judges of what kind of help they actually need. And sometimes, the wisdom to solve the most important problems comes in the smallest packages, carried by hands that may be young but are definitely not weak, guided by hearts that understand exactly what's worth fighting to protect. The Caldwell family had survived their greatest threat not through strength alone, but through the kind of love that expressed itself in daily care, mutual support, and the fierce determination to stay together no matter what challenges they faced. Spring would come again, bringing new possibilities and new challenges. But whatever the future held, they would face it as they always had, together, with wisdom born of experience and love that had grown stronger through testing. Miss Harper had come to Cedar Ridge to assess whether the Caldwell children were being raised properly. In the end, she'd learned that they were being raised perfectly, not according to some official standard, but according to the deeper requirements of family, community, and the kind of courage that bloomed in mountain soil and flourished under frontier skies. The wisdom of small hands had prevailed, proving that sometimes the most important victories came not from fighting, but from showing the world a better way to see what was already there.